Hey everybody, my name is Taylor Gibson, and this is the Gr8Wyte Experience. Hi everybody, welcome to the Gr8Wyte Experience, the show where I talk about anything and everything of interest. My name is Taylor Gibson. Thank you for listening. Today's episode is one where I will be breaking some new ground here today, as for the very first time I will be conducting an exclusive interview here on the Gr8Wyte Experience, and I have got a huge name to start this off today. My guest today is a Canadian sports television legend who's best remembered for his tenure at TSN alongside fellow TSN anchor Jay Onrait, becoming a household name as host of SportsCenter, which would spawn a successful podcast and a 2019 live tour across Canada. Nowadays, you can find him hosting his own podcast, BOOMSIES. And I cannot express how excited I am to say this. Please welcome to the show, Dan O'Toole. Toolsy, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
What's up, buddy? This camera angle makes it look like I got the largest Tim Hortons in the history. This is an extra large steep tea, but it looks massive. And roll up the rim is on. By the way, you can't even roll up the rim now.
What?
It's all on your phone. So the joy of winning and rolling it up, we can't even experience that now.
Oh, I know. See, younger generations, they'll never understand what it was like to chew the rim up with your bottom tooth and looking under to see if you won something.
The younger generation, well, you're probably even too young to remember trying to find a TV channel that came in clear by moving the antenna.
That is true. Yeah, unfortunately am not of that age, but I do remember people who've had those antenna, like the TVs with the antennas, and yeah, they literally were fucking 4 feet off the television itself.
No, see, our antenna was on top of the house.
Oh.
So you'd have to get up by the TV and had this big dial, and someone would sit back on the couch and you go, okay, move it a little bit. Okay, we got it. So, and we only had five channels to get. So the choices were limited. Needless to say, that's why all those shows back in that day had massive audiences, because there was nothing else to watch.
It's true. It's like when you look back on like The Littlest Hobo or Beachcombers and stuff like that on CBC, where it's like everybody remembers, like even Mr. Dress Up. Like everybody watched Mr. Dress Up back in the day.
That's right, because there was nothing else to watch. I remember leaving the house once and Mr. Dress Up was on, and I'm like, wouldn't it be great if we could pause the show and I could watch the rest when I got home? So I thought of a PVR before a PVR existed. Needless to say, I did not have the wherewithal or brains to ever figure out. I still don't. I know if you drop me back in caveman days to invent something like a cell phone now, even explain a cell phone, no clue. How does a cell phone work? No, I have no idea.
That's true. It's like an older generation when they get an iPhone or a Samsung or something, and they look at it and they're like, how do we use this thing? Like, how do we use the phone on this?
Yeah, it's, I know my vehicle works. I don't know how the engine works. So yeah, if you did drop me back in time, I'd be useless to try advance the cavemen's technology knowledge, because I don't understand it. I just go around with limited knowledge about everything.
Now, I know that my listeners here, Dan, will not understand, but at the current time that we're recording this, you're in the middle of a field or just off the road of a field.
That's right. Soon to be in that field. That's in the beautiful town of Newcastle, Ontario. They're building, I believe, 5,000 homes. So that field in about 5 years is going to be littered with a new subdivision. So I'm enjoying the view while I can.
Yeah, it looks like a great view, to be honest with you, man. But and I know,
well, it's that time of the year, though. Even if it was brilliantly sunny right now, it would look gray and just dirty. This is the time of the year where everything is like, we're all living in a bad dream, because it's got the dirt from the snow that was on it. There's no green out. It's like you're living in a horror movie every day.
Well, honestly, I mean, I'm used to living in the gray, living on Vancouver Island, where it's just rainy and cloudy and gray throughout most of the year anyway. And
Oh, where are you? Where are you on the island?
Duncan, just an hour north of Victoria.
Oh, okay. Beautiful. I love the island, but yeah, you got to be used to the rain if you live there.
Yeah, but it's not too bad. I mean, and I know when you guys came out to Victoria for your live show in 2019, like it was sunny. It was it was crazy warm that day, I remember too.
That's right. Well, I have my experience. I lived in Vancouver for a combined 3 years. And man, when it rains for a week and you get that sunny day in the middle of winter, you're like, okay, it was worth it. It was worth it just for this one day.
So, like I said, Toolsy, I'm super excited to have you on the program. And of course, I'm going to be covering your tenure at TSN when you worked at Fox Sports as well. But honestly, I want to start off this interview by asking about your new project, BOOMSIES. Now, for the people who don't know what BOOMSIES are, it's a new podcast that you started here back in January. At the time of this recording, 10 episodes have been recorded. And the show also features former Jan Dan podcast as well as a TSN producer Tim. And it's featured a number of guests, including former Blue Jay Gr8Wyte. And I know I re-listened to that interview yesterday for this interview. The podcast has been a great success, but I'd love to hear from yourself. Like, how did the idea for BOOMSIES come about?
Well, I didn't have a job, and my accountant was like, "You need to get a job." So I'm like, okay. What do I know how to do? And I'd done a podcast before with Jay, and I got approached by Bet Rivers, a company that's about to launch here on April 4th with the change of gambling in Canada. And they said, we'd love to sponsor whatever project you want to do. And I said, okay, how about a podcast? They said, perfect. And they were brainstorming names. I think the first name they came out was, I think we should call it Great Conversations in His Home with Dan O'Toole. And I said, that is the worst name I've ever heard for a podcast. I said, I've got one. And I said, BOOMSIES. And they said, actually, we like it. And then I explained that the term BOOMSIES came from my producer in LA by the name of Sean Keegan. During highlight packages and during the day, he'd say to us, if there's a great play or if he saw a hole in one, he'd say, BOOMSIES. Or someone fell flat on their face, BOOMSIES. And I'm like, it's an all-encompassing word. It's almost like an exclamation point. So we adopted BOOMSIES, and BOOMSIES was born in my basement. And by the way, as I sit on this road, I've described how I got a new vehicle on my podcast because my old one stopped working. And I bought the only one that was available. And it looks like a cop car. It looks like an undercover cop car SUV. So now I realize I'm sitting on the side of this road. Everyone thinks I'm a cop right now with radar as I do this interview. And I'm like, I am a real dick because I'm not a cop and they're all slowing down and giving me a look. Oh, man, now I feel really bad.
Can you only imagine if those people drive by and they're like, oh, shit, it's a cop. Hey, wait a minute, that's Dan O'Toole.
Hey, what's going on? So, yeah, I'm that guy right now. But, hey, maybe it's for the better because a lot of people motor down this road.
That is true. Now, I did mention producer Tim here a second ago, and I'd love to know because I know either on the Jan Dan podcast or when you guys were for SportsCenter, it was always a running joke of producer Tim being a chain smoker. How hard does producer Tim chain smoke through an episode of BOOMSIES?
I am happy to report he no longer smokes.
What?
Yes, producer Tim BOOMSIES, he no longer smokes. He quit it like a year ago. So Tim has kicked the habit. So I'm very happy to report that. What he used to, the way he used to smoke it was like cartoon-like style, like 2 puffs and that cigarette's gone. So he must have had really big lungs, but those lungs are much healthier now because Tim's off the darts.
That's crazy. I actually didn't even know that. No, when talking about his chain smoking, like, did producer Tim ever get a kick out of when you and Jay made fun of it on the podcast?
Oh, no, he hated it. He didn't want anyone to know. It was his dirty secret. He's like, why are you letting people know that I smoke? We're like, well, you do. He's like, well, people don't know. I'm like, well, if you stand beside a smoker, you know they smoke. So I think we kind of guilted him into not smoking. So I'm glad we were part of him becoming a healthier person.
Yeah, I can only imagine how much more agitated he must be now that he's off the darts.
He's very agitated human, but I think nicotine adds to your agitation. I don't know. He's just constantly agitated at all times. And a lot of people ask, they're like, well, because Tim and I would go like 6 months without speaking at times. So they're like, why did you want him part of this? And I said, because you need a person on your team that isn't just going to say yes to everything you do. And I'm like, Tim's that guy. He's almost like my safety net. So if I'm thinking of doing something, he'll like, you can't do that. And then we'll butt heads. And then in the end, I'll say, yeah, I guess Tim was right. So Tim's a good fixture of the podcast. And actually on this week's episode of Boomsies, we hear from Tim as he is our NHL trade deadline insider. This segment lasts 20 seconds.
Yeah. Is it just a lot of sound effects? Just a lot of...
I guess he'll have to tune in. You'll hear his voice.
There you go. So, Dan, like I said, like a lot of people would associate you during your tenure with TSN and to a lesser extent with Fox Sports. Now, where this all started is when you were attending Algonquin College, where you later graduated in 1996. Now, everybody through the JNDM podcast knows that you worked for their college radio station, CKDJ, and you would do play-by-play for the Ontario Hockey League's Ottawa 67s. And I know you've probably talked about this in a number of interviews, but I'd like to know for yourself, like how and when did you be inspired to get into broadcasting?
Really when I took a co-op program in high school at the university station, radio station in my hometown of Peterborough. And I started doing it for the co-op to get my credits. And I'm like, wow, this doesn't seem like a real job at all. And then it kind of just went from there, went from high school into college and then started my career that way. But it was all because I didn't want to have a real job. And I was successful in finding that area that didn't feel like work. But for today's aspiring broadcasters, it must feel like work because there's not a lot of jobs out there. And the jobs you do get, you kind of have to do multiple things associated with the job. So it's not like the old days when there was a number of jobs to be found at a radio station or a small town TV station, because when there used to be 10 jobs, there might be like 2 now at those stations. So it's very daunting.
What do you think, just for those reasons alone, that a lot of people going into broadcasting school are now turning to podcasting, just because, again, like they can create their own sort of content, but they can create it.
You mentioned it, Taylor, you mentioned it, content creation. That's what people want. I don't even know if you need to go to broadcast school now, because if you say like Steve Dangle, who he watches all Leafs games. So he's found an audience because he created that himself. If you create content that people will watch or listen to, then you might not even have to find an employer. Because if you look at ad revenues now, a lot of ads are spent on podcasts, on Instagram, on TikTok, on creators. So they pretty much bypass the big guy and go straight to the person creating the content. So that's how it is now. And that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future, because as I point out to people, the days of traditional media are over. If I gave my daughters $100 to find a channel or a show on cable TV, I would never be handing over that $100. So anyone under the age of 20 is never getting cable TV. They are never listening to the radio. So think of all that, those ad dollars that used to go to those 2 things alone, they're now going to go to the content creators.
That's absolutely true. And you made a great point with Steve Dangle, is that he didn't go to broadcasting school, but he basically made a career through YouTube. Through YouTube, watching the Leafs games, but even not so much even but even people in, say, professional sports, like you see it with Spit and Chicklets, where you see a couple of ex-NHLers that they have all this life experience, they start a podcast, they get picked up, and now they're one of the biggest podcasts in sports right now.
That's right. And I have a buddy, his name's Tank the Tech on YouTube. 1 or 2 years, 2 years ago, he decided to start his own YouTube channel in which he interviewed heavy metal bands. He now has 150,000 subscribers on YouTube. He just started it himself, and that's his full-time job now. He went out on a limb and said, I think I'm going to do this because I know people within the industry. He knows it's a very niche following. So they'll have built-in audience, and it worked out. And a lot of times it's going to be trial and error for people finding what will stick. Like you might start a podcast about the Leafs and say, oh, there's too many of these out there, and then do an offshoot of that, because he goes from a guitar tech to just talking to musicians, in which it's got a entirely graspable fan base that was there, but then it expands beyond that because he gets into other guests that just aren't into heavy metal and stuff. So the opportunities are endless. It's just finding that lane to go down first. That's the tough one, because how long do you, again, I'm just spitballing here, how long do you give something to find if it has an audience? Because some people might say, oh, I'm going to give it a couple months, but someone else might say, no, you got to give it a year. Someone else might say, well, if it doesn't catch on in a month, yes, try something different. So everyone's just figuring that out as we go. We're all in it, figuring it out.
Yeah, but I know even for myself being a podcaster, I know that it's very different if you look at it from a career versus a hobby. If you look at it as a hobby, then you really wouldn't care if it takes off. Like, you're really happy if it takes off. But if you look at it as a career, you're just like, man, I got to figure something out. I got to figure out how this is going to take off. Now, I just want to swing back here and talk about your time at Algonquin College. And like I said, through the Jay and Dad podcast, everybody knew you talking about your time at Algonquin College and CKDJ. The CKDJ tapes, when you brought those into the podcast, how hard did you cringe having to listen back to those after all those years?
Oh, it was horrible. I could CKDJ. I was trying to be person on the radio. I wasn't being myself, because I'm like, well, this is what people sound like on the radio. So I tried to emulate that, when that's not what you're supposed to do. But try tell that to a kid that's in broadcast school. But at the time, I thought I was crushing it. Like when I was live on the air and I was recording my air checks, I thought, man, I must be top of the class. And then my instructor would say, like, okay, you got to work on this. I'm like, what is he talking about? Man, I'm killing it. But now I think back and I'm like, of course, as a kid, you think you know everything when really you know nothing.
Yeah, and I don't even, I can only speak for myself here, Dan, is that I do a hockey podcast, Third Line Plug Sunscast. And I remember when I first started that about 5 years ago, I had the same kind of mindset. I was, yeah, I'm killing it. I'm crushing it. I listened back to it. I'm like, oh my God, what the hell was I thinking? And all I thought of was your CKDJ tapes. And I was like, okay, I now know what Dan must felt like having to listen back to those.
I get that feeling when, so I did a podcast today and they played old clips from Jay and I on TSN. I cringe at those because I've progressed so much as a broadcaster, even since then, that I cringe just as bad as my CKDJ tapes, because I didn't know what I was doing. Jay and I were still establishing our chemistry. Everything was scripted. I didn't know how to act when we were doing a bit. So yeah, I cringe at those as well. And I find them very embarrassing when people play those clips.
I will say one thing though, is anytime I hear Supergrass, whether it comes out on Spotify or heard it on the radio, all I hear is Supergrass on Snuts 96.9. I just crack.
96.9.
Now, one final thing I want to talk about Algonquin College, and I mentioned I do an Ottawa Senators podcast, and you and I were talking about off air that I had Stuntman Stu, former Ottawa Senators public address announcer, and I know you and him attended Algonquin College at the time. Do you have any great stories from him during your time at Algonquin College?
Yes. I remember him just being a polished professional broadcaster. And I'm like, has he already been to school? Because he already had the voice and he knew how to do commercial breaks. And I'm just like, wow, what am I up against here? But I remember Stuntman Stu coming to a house party that I threw once. And all my friends from Peterborough came up, and Stu kind of realized I was the way I was after meeting my friends. So he will always point to that party. People's heads were going through walls. People were falling downstairs. And so when he showed up at school on Mondays, like, now I understand. So yeah, Stu's remained a friend to this day. He's a mainstay in Ottawa broadcasting, still on the radio there. So yeah, he's done amazing and has done amazing in his fight with cancer as well.
He has, and I got a chance to talk with him about that. But I think for me, the one story that really sticks out for Stu when I got a chance to work with him was I remember this is pre-Zoom when we were still using Skype, and I sent him the Skype link. He couldn't log into his account. So when he finally got on, we ended up calling him. First thing he says is, guys, I'm not going to lie to you. I am so fucking sick of Skype. And he went on a 20, 30-second rant about how much he hates Skype. And my co-host and I were looking at each other going, oh my God, this is amazing. How are we not recording this right now?
And I actually, 2 podcasts ago, I detailed how Skype used to be all anyone knew for video messaging. And then the pandemic hits and Zoom takes over the market. And then I did some further research and Skype was bought by Microsoft for like $8.1 billion. And now Skype is part of Microsoft Teams. But Skype had the entire market, but you just detailed how they lost that market, because even if someone sent you the link, you're like, well, it's asking me for my ID, and no one knows what the ID is. So you spend 30 minutes trying to log in. Well, Zoom, you don't need an ID. Someone sends you a link, you click on it, you're there. It's amazing. So Zoom, I don't know where it came from, but you're doing great.
So fast forwarding here a little bit. Now, I know that you mentioned earlier that you were living in Vancouver for a couple of years. And when you first came out of Algonquin College, you did work in Vancouver as a reporter for radio stations, one of them being a country station here called JRFM. And later you would go to Fort McMurray, where you were, as you've mentioned, being the play-by-play for the Oil Barons and working CTV Edmonton. Spoken at length regarding your time in those markets, what aspects during this period did you take over when you later joined TSN?
Oh, I learned how to do everything, because when I was doing airborne traffic reporting, I learned how to do something I'd never done. I also learned how to fly a plane, because when we were up there flying around a little Cessna, the pilot would ask, you want to fly? And had I actually started to get my pilot's license, I would have got it, because I did that many flights. But then when I went to Fort McMurray, I did sports on the radio station there, learned how to actually speak like a normal human on the radio. And then while I was there as well, I got into TV. I went to the local cable station, asked if I could put together a show. So I got my chops in TV established there as well. So it's like going back to what I said to aspiring broadcasters, learn how to do every single thing. Like, they gave me a camera and said, go. So I'm like, okay, I got to figure out how to shoot this. And I was brutal at the beginning. I'd send the tape back. They're like, you got to stop moving the camera at some point. I was just like going like this the entire time. They're like, okay, stop. I'm like, okay. And also white balance the camera. I'm like, how do you do that? So I learned how to interview people. I learned how to shoot. I learned how to edit. And when I got to TSN, even though I didn't have to shoot or edit, it gives you a better understanding of everyone working behind the scenes on things you're putting on air. It gives you a better appreciation. So yeah, every little nugget of info that you get on your way to your job that you dream of, you use all that even without even knowing it.
Well, it's kind of like what we were saying about podcasting, where it's kind of like trial and error of trying to figure out
Yes.
what works, what doesn't. And eventually when you figure out something that works, you go with that, right?
Yeah. And speaking of that, we're getting a new system that, again, we said we wanted to do a podcast. We had a sponsor behind it. And then they're like, okay, you set to go. I'm like, no, we need microphones and we got to record onto something. So we had to figure all that out. And we wanted to be a standalone operation with myself and my 2 producers. We didn't want to have to rely on anyone else. So my producers watched YouTube videos on the best ways and best platforms to record on, how to publish it with good sound. So it's still a learning progress. We're still learning along the way, because we're getting a new system in which they don't even have to come to my house to record the podcast, but they've got to be trained on this system. So yes, 1 year from now, I'm sure we'll still be having this conversation, because we'll be trying something else new. Or right now, if someone came to my house for a live in-person interview, we don't know how to do it. because the audio hookup, it sounds like, okay, just plug another mic in, but it's not that easy because you're doing things from a computer and it won't recognize the other mic. It's just things you never think about when you're listening to someone else's podcast. How did they get that other mic now? But now when I see someone in studio, I'm like, they know how to hook that up. I wish I knew how.
Yeah, it's either that or you get the both of you together and you just put the mic in between you two. And
exactly. I guess we can do that now that the mask mandate is dropped. But yeah, I was even thinking about that. I'm like, well, if I get someone in my tiny studio, is someone going to say, oh, you're breaking COVID rules? But they just dropped the mask mandate here in Ontario, so we don't have to worry about that.
When talking about your tenure at TSN, everybody will remember you best alongside Jay Onrait. And I always found your partnership with Jay Onrait very fascinating, as in the United States, and I think Jay's talking about this in another podcast, where at ESPN you had Patrick and Olbermann, and local markets had sportscasters that had personality and humor. And I know for myself here in BC, we had Don Taylor for a long time working at Sports Page and then working with Sportsnet. And I always
had Squire Barnes.
And Squire Barnes. I love Squire. He was awesome. But but even the dynamic between you two, where Jay was this kind of wacky, kind of off the wall guy when it came to the humor, and you were more of the straight man or the setup guy in that. I got to ask about your partnership. First of all, are you surprised at all by the overall success that you and Jay had on television?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I never thought we'd go into anything beyond the 2 a.m. originally show that we were doing live every night. To get the chance to bring that to the States and then bring it back to Canada was, I don't even dream that big. But once we started doing the show, and again, I pointed to those old clips, we didn't know what we were doing. It was a feeling out process. It was like a kid in the minors for baseball or hockey relearning the game, which they knew how to play, but no, you got to learn how to play it at the big league level. And there was no one really that we could watch and get it from, because you can't teach chemistry. It was just the more shows we put in, the more comfortable we came with one another. And then establishing, yes, I'm the straight man. And Jay mentioned something in the first year of doing shows. He said a joke during a highlight pack, and then I said something like, oh yeah, that must have hurt. Some dumb line. And then we went to commercial break. And during the commercial, he's like, if it's not funny, don't even say anything. So that always stayed with me, because the biggest thing when you have a tandem is being quiet. 80% of the time, remain silent to let the joke land. And for a young broadcaster, like in those old clips, there's no silence. We're like, ha, 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 ha. We don't let the joke breathe, when it's the most difficult thing as a broadcaster on live television is to be quiet, because dead air is the worst thing. But when you become used to it and you know the guy's going to fill that dead air eventually with something funny, it's much easier to do. But it's like gaining the confidence to walk on a tightrope. Okay, well, I think I'm going to fall. And then eventually, like, okay, I know I'm not going to fall. And you have trust in the guy waiting for you on the other side. So that takes years and years to establish. And luckily we had it, since we worked together since 2004 all the way to 2021. So that's a pretty good run.
It is a really good run. And I always think about, because you mentioned about dead air, and one of the things that I find with even doing this podcast is, if, say, my co-host says something and I don't have a response, sometimes the dead air works. It works in more establish what they just said, and you're just like, okay, I don't know how to respond to that. But even when I look back on those old clips of you and Jay at Sports Center, I remember just thinking, one of the big things for me was there was the ad for the Shticky. And Jay, I don't know how this all happened, but Jay brought it in, and you had the paper clips and crap on your shoulder, and he's like sweeping it off. The look on your face, you're like, I can't do it. I cannot hold a straight face anymore.
Yes. And that's what I could never do. So our main goal, without even saying it to one another, was to try make the other guy laugh every show that we did together. And in the past 4 years, from our shows from 2017 to 2021, we laughed more than we ever had in our lives. Like, tears in our eyes can't continue speaking. We're laughing so hard at the absurdity of something we've just seen or something that was just said. And that's where producer Tim would get in our ear and say, you're on live television. This is a sports program. And we're like, well, we can't talk. So yeah, those moments, not that they were forced before, but they came much more naturally the later we got on in our career.
Yeah. Well, was that something that the producers at TSN really pushed for you and Jay to be funny, or was that just more?
No, they hated it. We'd always get a message from our bosses like every 3 months, dial it back 20%. So they eventually stopped sending those. But yeah, we had producers that hated our shtick. They did not like our show one bit. And if they ever had to produce it, they let it be known that they didn't want any shenanigans. And we just found that comical. We're like people that never liked our show. They're like, you guys try too hard, or this is a sports show. Okay, but we don't want to do that. And we aren't trying too hard. In fact, we don't try at all. We're just trying to go goof around. There's so many places to get your sports highlights and your scores. Just don't watch our show then. Why is this affecting your life? Go watch another show, because there's plenty out there. And that's how we did it. Once we ignored the haters, we're like, let's just do a show that we would sit down and watch. And that's what we accomplished.
Well, do you think just because like you guys are doing it at that late slot at TSN, do you think maybe that's where you probably could have done it more? Like if you'd done it at, say, a prime time hour, or you'd done it at like an early show at TSN, do you think it maybe wouldn't have worked?
Yeah, because we always figured 90% of our audience was either stoned or drunk. So we're like, if you look at the ads running during those shows, it's all fast food. So they know their audience. It's like guys sitting at home or girls, and they're like, oh man, I'm hungry. So those were the people watching our shows. And I'm like, they'll get these jokes. So it was the perfect built-in audience. Yes, the late night audience that had just got home from the bar, just got home from work. But they repeated that show up until noon the next day on the morning loop. And our humor is so sophomoric that it resonated with young kids. The greatest thing we ever heard was whenever we're out like doing the craft celebration tour at a hockey game, was families coming up and saying, we put the show on in the morning while we're getting ready for work and school, and my mom even watches now, or my dad, who wasn't a sports fan, he watches now, and we all watch it together. So that was our greatest badge of honor, was families watching it, and that every person in the family took something from it and was able to find it entertaining.
Well, I mean, I could totally relate to that to myself, because I remember when you guys were at TSN, like I was in early high school, later high school, when it would come back in the morning. And I remember watching it thinking, yeah, these guys are pretty funny. But even my mom, who's not even into sports, and I took her to see you guys in Victoria when you did your live show. And it was one of those things where she knows that, okay, she's not into sports. She kind of knows who you guys were. And she laughed. She loved it. She's like, oh, these guys are funny, man.
Well, I appreciate that. And that was, by the way, a beautiful theater in Victoria that we performed at. What was it called? Like the Regent?
Royal Theater.
The Royal Theater, yeah. So that's something we love to hear, is someone's mom or dad who never watched sports just sitting down to watch it with their kids, and that brings us so much joy.
Well, I think my mom, even when you guys were at Fox Sports, and I remember back in the day, they had the soundboard for the app. We had all the apps from the podcast, and the Old Man Toolsy bit just cracked her up so bad, and she loved it. But actually, going back to what we were saying about,
do you know who voiced Old Man Toolsy?
Who?
Gino
Retta?
That's Gino's voice. Old Man Toolsy. Oh no, Gino. No, sorry. Gino does the silent assassin. I voice the Old Man Toolsy. Gino's voice is on the Dan O'Toole silent assassin.
Yeah.
So I got that wrong. Sorry, I apologize.
No, that's all good. But even going back to your guys' live show, and I can't remember if you mentioned this on Boomsies. I remember you guys mentioned it on the Janda podcast, where you guys were talking about that one person in the front row that ended up throwing up in the alley. in the
Yes, someone did throw up. That was the only
hilarious.
theater.
I was on the other side. I was on the other side. I remember when that happened. I looked over and I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah. And it ties back into the people that watched our show on SportsCenter on TSN. Our audience liked to drink because after we had finished everything we had to do at the theater, we were leaving, and there were the biggest garbage bags I've ever seen in my life full of beer cans. And I'm like, holy crap, we got some drinkers here. So that's where it hit home. And I'm like, yeah, that guy vomiting makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it is true. Because I remember even when I was walking to my seats, there were people and they were getting rowdy. It was like, wow. Geez.
Well, it's perfect. We scheduled it we always did shows on a Friday or a Saturday, and it's a night out. You should be out there to have a good time. We didn't want to have it midweek. Get a babysitter. Come on out, have a blast. And then, so we got to do Western Canada, and then the pandemic hit. So we didn't get, we didn't get to do Eastern Canada because the pandemic hit. So maybe in the not too distant future, we can still do Eastern Canada.
So moving away from your time at TSN, and we got to talk about your time at Fox. In 2013, you and Jay left TSN to join Fox Sports 1, where you would work until 2017. One thing that really sticks to mind for me is that I know yourself and Jay have spoken negatively in the past of how Fox Sports 1 was run, especially in the final couple of years where your guys' show changed, where it went from like the air hangar studio to being filmed in a closet. Despite all of that, do you look back on your time at Fox as an overall experience?
I've never spoken negatively of Fox. I have nothing but great things to say about Fox. The only thing I say is it could have been handled better. I almost said betterly. It could have been handled better the way in which the show was approached, because it was the classic case of too many cooks in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. They're like, okay, let's get Gary Payton, Andy Roddick, Ephraim Salom, Carissa Thompson, Gabe Kapler, and then get these two guys from Canada, and that'll work. And you're like, that's too many ingredients. So from the get-go, and then plus when you're launching a new station in the States, considering how many channels there are now, good luck finding it.
Yeah.
So it was just, they tried too many things. And then going back to when we discussed how long do you give something to breathe, they would try a new idea. 2 weeks later, that didn't work. Let's try something else. So in hindsight, I'm sure the powers that be would have done things a lot differently. But as a company to work for, Fox Sports was the best sports organization I've ever worked for in my life, hands down. Like, they just treated us like gold. It was a great environment. The morale was better than any staff I've ever been a part of, on camera, off camera. The amount of people employed alone. Here in Canada, you might have 2 camera people working on a show. At Fox, there'd be 8 stagehands. There'd be 6 people in wardrobe. There'd be 2 people in makeup. There'd be 5 camera people. Like, I'm like, holy crap, this is amazing. So it was very eye-opening and something that I'm so happy I was able to experience.
And I do apologize. That's what I was trying to refer to, was that of all the cooks in the kitchen.
Oh yeah, I understood. I know.
No, it's all good. And when talking about Fox Sports, and I remember for a lot of, because up here in Canada, we didn't get Fox Sports 1. So obviously for us, there was a 4-year period where Canadians didn't get a chance to see you on TV, but we did get a chance to listen to you on the podcast, which you guys actually started at TSN, I believe in 2012, 2011, around there on the
2000. It was 2009, because 2019 was the 10-year anniversary. That's why we did the tour.
Okay. Yeah. Cause I remember, like, when you guys were at TSN, you had the podcast, but then when you went to Fox, you started the Jay and Dan podcast 2.0. And this is part of time where, like I said, Canadians didn't get a chance to see on television, but they got to listen to you through a podcast. And I think that's why a lot of fans still hold that so near dear to their hearts, like myself. And when you were at TSN, you maybe had Stoff working with you as a producer. Then you get to Fox, and now you have Mike Botticello, Pot Meldowney, Engineer Jim, and, well, later Ben Teller, I guess. Yeah. And, well, it was very obvious that the chemistry between you and Jay was there from your time on television to the podcast. But now you go to Fox, and now you're working with 3 to 4 guys who you have never met before. You didn't know much about them. You really didn't know what the chemistry was going to be like. So when did you begin to realize, like, when your guys' group for 2.0, the chemistry was there?
It was just meeting them before we even went in. We're like, well, this guy has no clue what he's doing. We're going to make fun of him. Engineer Jim, this guy used to do the sound mixing and engineering for Guns N' Roses. This is unreal. It's just like a cast of characters where no one took themselves seriously. So once you figured that out, you're like, oh, we can bust this guy's balls, no problem. Because if you had a stuck-up person who was there to do a professional job, it wouldn't have worked. So luckily we got a great band of characters that just went along for the ride. And Pat Muldowney always points back to that was the most fun he's ever had in his broadcast career was working on that podcast. So yeah, it's great hearing stuff like that and keeping in touch with those people. That reminds me, I have engineer Jim on standby to come on Boomsies. I got to make that happen soon. Thanks for the reminder.
Well, I'm glad they can do that, unintentionally. But yeah, even for myself, like the Jane Dad Podcast 2.0 was something that I listened to every single week. I loved every episode. Now, in saying that, Dan, I actually got a couple of guests here I want to ask you about. And of course, I got to start off with legend isn't the word I want to use because it's so overused, but an instant classic, Joel Klatt. From gang showers, minor league baseball, stories that he told on the podcast. And well, it became very apparent. Anybody who listened to those episodes were like, oh my God, this guy is amazing. How did these guys discover this? But I actually want to know for yourself, like, because back in the day when Chappelle's Show was back on, Dave always talked about how Charlie Murphy came to the lunchroom telling stories about Rick James and Prince and all these stories. Was that the same sort of thing with Joel Klatt?
We never knew these stories existed until we started prying, and he would just lay them out. It's like going to dinner with someone and then realizing they're a billionaire and then they're going to pay for every meal for the rest of your life. You're like, I didn't know this well was there to be tapped. But Joel Klatt, every time he came on, was just a delight and such a professional broadcaster. Now we can say that we knew him before he was part of the biggest college football broadcast team in America. So yeah, Joel, that's another great reminder. I need to have him on and get another news story because he is just a treasure trove and he's such a good storyteller. That's what makes him good or great, because of his storytelling abilities. He could turn me sitting in this field doing this podcast into a 10-minute yarn in which you would not ever turn away from.
Yeah, but going back to what I was saying about my mom and when I took her to the Jane Dad Podcast, this is one of these things where I showed her the very first episode you guys did with Klatt and just the gang shower story and that laugh that he did, and she's crying, she's laughing so hard, and she's just like, who is this guy? And I'm like, it's Joel Klatt. Yeah. They work with Jane Dan down at Fox.
That's Joel Klatt, a legend.
But when you guys were doing that first episode, did you know right away this is somebody that the fans are going to want to have back?
Oh yeah, we only pick people that you'd gravitate towards. That's kind of what I do with my current guests on the podcast I'm doing now. Is I only pick people that I'd want to have dinner with, because there's nothing worse than forcing a conversation. And that's what I like to have as a conversation and not an interview with everyone that appears. And that's what we've always done with our old podcast as well, is just, let's just shoot the shit, go in with no agenda. We aren't there to get someone say, oh, gotcha, you said that. Let's play that clip over and over. So yeah, that's why Joel resonated with the listeners, because he's a real person and a real character.
Yeah, it's kind of like with Howard Stern, when he talks about his radio show, that it's basically 3-4 hours of him just talking. He doesn't really have
few
things planned, but for the most part, he's just sort of off the cuff. Now, another guy I want to talk about, and this is a guy who was virtually unknown in Canada, but became a hit with the listeners, Peter Schrager. And this is a guy who loved his trips to Olive Garden. And of course, he became a fan favorite in Canada just because he would make old goalie references like Ron Tugnut, who I got a chance to interview on the hockey podcast. I got to ask about Schrags. Like, how enjoyable was that to work with that guy?
It was amazing. So Schrager was our NFL insider. And this is, like you said, when I first started working with him at Fox, his headshot was like from his college days. No one knew who Schrager was. Now he's a huge star. He's on the NFL Network morning show. He's on NFL sidelines during the season. He is constantly breaking news on Twitter. So now everyone knows him. But back in the day, man, yes, he just start rhyming out like, oh, that's like Mike Richter. Mike Richter. Is that a Mike Liute? And then people loved that. And then we get to work for a month with Schrager in Russia because Jay and I went to our bosses and said, hey, we should go do our shows from Russia during the Olympics. And they said, sure, why not? So Schrager was part of our crew along with Robert Lucetich and Julie Stewart-Binks. And Chris Chelios and Michelle Kwan were also part of our crew. But Schrager, we get to spend a month with him, one of the funniest humans I've ever met. Each day we'd wake up and we're like, what the hell are we doing here? How did we ever convince them to send us to Russia? And we still say that in a text chain that we're all involved in now. We're like, remember we were all in Russia at one point? Yeah, we did that.
Yeah, because you guys were with, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan Patrick as well?
We met Dan Patrick in a steam shower in Russia. He walked in just going, he goes, I'm not feeling well, guys. And we're like, we're in a steam shower. What the hell's going on here? So that was our first time meeting Dan Patrick in a Russian steam shower.
God, could you imagine doing that today? Somebody walks in a steam shower and they start coughing. You're like, nope, we're out.
Oh, no. So again, I mentioned the mask mandate was dropped. I went into the grocery store wearing a mask and I sneezed into that mask. And I gotta go, just think now, my sneeze would have been all over that store. So I protected people. So if people still want to wear masks, don't give them any grief. Just let them do it. I just proved alone that a mask worked by sneezing into it.
Now, with the Jay and Dad podcast, you had a number of one-time guests, and a few of them that I remember off the top of my head. One of them for myself, and this is one that I don't know if many of the fans would really greatly appreciate, but for myself, I really loved, was former Marlins pitcher Dontrelle Willis. And while
D-Train,
love D-Train, that episode was fantastic. It was one of the main episodes. When I go back and listen to 2.0, he is one of those interviews I listen to, and I'm just like, this guy's funny. How did they not have him back for a second go?
Yeah, he is amazing. I actually sent him a text to come on this week's podcast for a baseball insider. He didn't text me back, so I don't know if he changed his number or just ignoring me. But D-Train, man, to just sit and hear him talk. And I always wanted to start a show after hearing him tell a story about a city championship. He grew up in Oakland, and he and someone else that was in our green room at that time started talking because they played in the same game against each other. And the excitement that they got talking about this little league or high school game, I had the vision of them like the greatest game you've never heard of, and get these people to detail how the entire city came to watch this game. And that's where they were fully invested and loved the game. There was no money involved. It was just the pure joy that the game brought them. And whenever I think of Dontrelle, I always think of his excitement describing that city championship game, and just him, and I forget who it was, going back and forth about how the city got behind them. But yeah, D-Train is just, as soon as he walks into the room, just brings a breath of fresh air into any room he enters.
Well, go back to what I was saying, like with how good that episode was he somebody that you and Jay got a number of requests from fans to bring back?
I forget. I don't know. Probably any guest we've ever had, people have asked us to bring back. But when you're working at a place like Fox, it's a treasure chest. So getting to them the first time, let alone the second time, is difficult. Like on that show, we had Conor McGregor in our studio before anyone knew who Conor McGregor was. Ronda Rousey was on that show. Nate Diaz was on that show. Just because we always said it was the car wash. So if a star would come in, they would make them do our show. They make them do another show. They make them do our podcast as well. So by the time this person left, they're like, we're never coming back here again, because they just made me actually do work. But yeah, when you look back at the guests we had drop in, it was pretty amazing. Actually, I mentioned I was on a podcast earlier. They played a clip of Conor McGregor when we first had him on, and it's a young Conor McGregor wearing like a golf shirt he got at like H&M in an interview. I'm like, Conor wouldn't even wear that now. So to see how far he's come in his wealth, and to ever imagine that he'd get to the point he is now, yeah, that was something we wouldn't even have imagined to happen.
Well, that must be really surreal. I know you talked about Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey. Is that still really surreal for you when you look back on those days and you're like, oh my God, I had this person on, I had this person on, we had this person on before everybody knew who they were?
Yeah, it's kind of neat to look back, because one of Conor's biggest interviews when he was on his way up was his interview with Nate Diaz, where we just kept poking them and prodding them, and then they just started going at it. They were in different rooms on video link up, so they couldn't see each other. All they could hear each other. And to this day, it's one of my favorite clips because it's Conor at his finest. And Nate later entered our studio a couple of years later, and he's like, "Oh, it's you guys. All I heard in that interview was you laughing in my ear." And I'm like, "Oh my God, we're going to get the crap beat of us by Nate Diaz." But he's like, "It's all good." So I'm like, thank God. It was the most terrified I've been in my life.
Now, another one-time guest I want to bring up, and this one came as a real surprise back in the day when I listened to it, because again, her appearance came as a real surprise with given how well-spoken she was and how knowledgeable she was with sports. Former adult film star Lisa Ann. And I just remember, the main thing I remember from that interview, other than her telling stories and all that stuff, was her reaction when you told her that Mike asked Twitter for questions. The reaction she got, she goes, "Oh, I bet you guys got a lot of stuff that surprised you."
Yeah, I completely forgot about that, because I think she was promoting some fantasy football thing that she was running. I don't know if she's still doing that, but yeah, Lisa Ann, she was a great person to talk to, because again, Jay and I, we kind of just put people at ease. Once they know that we aren't going to hit them with hard-hitting questions and we're just having a chat, then they just really relax. So maybe I should dial up Lisa Ann for Boomsies.
Oh, could you imagine the traffic you would get with Lisa Ann on there?
Yeah, I should. Well, that's a good idea. I've got 3 guests now just from talking to you.
There you go, man. There you go. But even for myself, like going back to what I was saying with the Lisa Ann interview, I was really surprised, just because usually you get this image in your head when it comes to porn stars or adult film stars where they're probably very airheaded. They're really like, oh yeah, whatever. She comes on and she's very personable. She's very knowledgeable about sports. And I bring this up because I know later on you would have Nikki Benz on the show. And I remember looking back on that and thinking, Jay and Dan seemed just looking at you like, okay, I guess this is an episode.
I completely forgot about that. I don't remember one thing from the Nikki Benz one. Yeah, that's a weird one. She
didn't even want to be there. She just looked like somebody asked her and she's like, all right, okay.
Yeah, I could see that. Maybe because Jay knew who she was and the other guys in the studio, I'm like, I've never seen or heard of this person in my life. So I'm sure that's one of the ones where they're like, we've got her. And I'm like, okay. My heart was probably not in that interview.
No, but even when I listened back to the Lisa Ann interview, like I said, her reaction to you asking about Mike asking Twitter. Another thing is that Ben Taylor got thrown under the bus because they were talking. Jay and you looked at him, be like, so Ben, do you have a porn problem? And he just goes, well, I mean, what 26-year-old doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good response from Ben.
Yeah. Now, another guy I want to bring up here, and like Joel Klatt, he was a multiple-time podcast guest and a huge fan favorite, former Our Lady Peace drummer Jeremy Taggart. And the reason why I bring him up is because he was a great guest on the show, but it was on the Jay and Dan podcast where he first announced that him and Jonathan Torrens started the podcast, Taggart and Torrens. And I want to get your thoughts on just the success that he and Jeremy have had with their podcast.
Oh, it's not a surprise. 2 Canadian icons, one in music, one in acting and comedy. So Jeremy was actually our first ever guest in studio on the Jay and Dan podcast. And Torrens came along, and I actually spent time at his house when I went on an RV trip with my kids.
I remember that. I remember hearing about that.
He jokingly said, yeah, why don't you stop by? And the week we were leaving, I'm like, hey, we're coming. And he's like, I guess this is happening. Pull up, parked in his driveway, and didn't move for 3 days in Nova Scotia. So they both remain very close friends. And it's not a surprise at all because they're both funny. They're both eccentric in a great way, and they just gel. So I was able to see one of their live tour stops in Toronto, and the following that they have is just amazing. Just a great community of people all there with the same mindset, just to laugh and have fun and just be good people.
Yeah. Was this the tour stop in Toronto where it was at the apartment building, or was it somewhere else?
No, this was at a little theater that was at Queen and Dovercourt, because I went and I had to work that night, but I went down and appeared for like 10 minutes. I played a little game on stage with them and then got the hell out of there because I had to go to work. But yeah, it was so they haven't toured since the pandemic either. So they're probably raring to get back on the road.
Well, I know for myself, like I got a chance to see them when they came to Vancouver Island, did 2 shows. And I brought my mom to the one, brought my dad to the other. And my dad, I think he had more of an understanding who they were because, again, my dad knew who Arlie Peace was. He watched Trailer Park Boys, so he kind of knew who both of them were. But just how personable they were with the fans. And it wasn't like, okay, show's over, they're sitting in the green room till it's ready to go. They come in the audience and they're chatting with everybody and they're, hey, what's going on? How'd you enjoy the show? It was awesome.
That's right. As I tell my kids, it doesn't cost anything just to be nice to people, and then they'll remember that. If they spent the time and energy to get your show and they want to spend a few minutes with you, yes, of course, you took the time to come see me. All I can do is take the time to have a chat. So that's how we always have approached everything, and that's how I approach everything in life. Just don't be a dick. Just be nice.
I mean, this is a perfect example right here where I'm breaking kayfabe. I just DM'd you on Instagram, like, hey, do you want to do the podcast? And you're like, all right.
Yeah, why not? You found a day. Monday, Tuesdays are my go-to. And I'm like, I finished that other one. I got time before dinner. Let's do it.
Now, I'm going to, getting away from Fox, SC was Jay and Dan. And when you guys returned to TSN 2017, you would work with the show until, unfortunately, you were laid off this past year. Now, one of the big things, like I said, with the Fox Sports era, where 2.0 was definitely the highlight for a lot of fans, you guys brought the podcast back for 3.0, but also you did a cross-country live show. And I mentioned earlier, we saw you in Victoria. When looking back on that live tour, I'm not going to say that I'm sure you probably weren't surprised by the response, but when you guys threw the news out there, were you kind of just taken back, like, oh my God, all these people want to see us just do what we do live?
Well, when you go into something like that, your fear is no one's going to show up because you don't really know. Hang on, my car's about to, there we go. Until you actually go out on stage, you don't know if anyone's going to be there. So after we got the first trial show under our belt, we're like, okay, there is an audience, there's an appetite for this. And we didn't want to do anything with regards to scheduling it because we would have effed it up and ended up in the wrong cities. So we mentioned it on the podcast, and then a booking agency reached out to us and they said, okay, if we handle everything, do you want to do it? And we said, yes, we don't want to do anything. So they booked the venues. They did it to fit our schedules around our kids' schedules. And that's how it worked. But yes, to know that it was going to be successful, we didn't know until that first show when we walked out on the stage and we're like, okay, there's people here. This is going to work.
Yeah, because I know, like, I've talked to people who got the chance to see you guys in other cities, and it was just like, yeah, the fan response was great. These guys were awesome. But when talking about your time at SC with Jay and Dan, and when I was watching that back when it first came out, I felt, okay, the show has a similar feel to the OG show that you guys did, but it had a bit of a Tim and Sid feel to it, as what you guys did with interviews or some of the online content. I got to ask about that because I know, was that something that TSN was pushing given how successful Tim and Sid were over at Sportsnet?
Oh, that never even entered the conversation. I never even thought of it that way. It's just because we had a sit down area. We had a big set. So they wanted to take advantage of it, and they wanted to have different sponsors. So they had to have a different look. They couldn't be at the desk the whole time. So it was just built out of a necessity for sponsorship to pay for the show. So that's why we had those seats, because they were the cooler side seats. So that's why we sat in chairs, because of ad dollars. Not to change the dynamic, but it actually added another level that we could work with because we had our walkover. We could sit back and lounge, and we weren't always stuck behind a desk. So it actually gave us more room to play with, more leash to try new things. So yeah, we liked it. At first, it felt weird getting up and walking over a new set, but hey, we made we made it work.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, and I know with Tim and Sid over at Sportscaster, what was your and Jay's reaction when you see them gaining gaining the following that they did after you guys left TSN for Fox Sports 1?
Oh, whenever anyone succeeds, I'm happy for them. That means they're employed, means other people working on their show are employed. We've always got along great with them. I always thought when you got into this industry, you'd hate all the competitors. And I think it may have been that way at some point. But with social media and stuff now, we always direct message each other. And yeah, to see other people's success, I always like to see people succeed. So I was so happy that they got their show that worked, and then they kind of broke up at the same time as we did. I don't know who did it first, but I'm glad they're still both employed.
Yeah. Well, and I know when talking about what you're talking about, Tim and Sid, and with the hockey podcast I do, we've had Brent Wallace, who formerly worked for TSN as well. And that was a similar feel that he got, because again, being the Ottawa bureau chief is that you really only know, and you only get to really recognize people who worked for Sportsnet, like with Ian Mendez and him at TSN. Now, unfortunately, I do got to bring up the Bell layoffs of 2021. Like I said, Brent Wallace got let go, Natasha Dashevsky, yourself. There was a number of people at TSN. Regardless of how it may have ended for yourself at TSN, how do you look back on your second go around at TSN?
Oh, as I say to anyone who will listen, and Jay agrees with me, our shows from 2017 to 2021 were our best shows we've ever done. Just because we had the experience to bring from Fox. We had our experience from our previous show that we did in Canada, and we got to put all that together. It's like building a plane, and we started with no parts, or we started with all the parts, but didn't know how to put them together. Then after 15 years of working together, we're like, now we know, that part goes there, that part goes there. And we knew how to put it all together. So the worst part was knowing that the show we were putting out was the favorite thing we'd ever done, and then it got the plug pulled on it. So that was the biggest kick in the balls, was knowing we were so proud of the product that we were putting out.
Yeah. But even when you guys were doing SE with Jay and Dan during the 2020 COVID pandemic, I know you guys are doing everything through Zoom. I've got to quickly ask, like, how different was that? Because again, you guys.
Oh, it was horrible doing the show from home because we pre-taped it. Someone's Wi-Fi would go down, or someone would get a call on their phone. We were miserable. We're like, can someone get us back to a studio? So that was the low point of our careers, because we hated it, and we couldn't interact with one another because we were on a delay. So if he said something, I couldn't even laugh or anything because it was out of sync. So that was horrible. The shows from home were just brutal.
Yeah. Well, how did it change the dynamics of writing the show? And I know it must have been different when you guys are in studio, you have to write the show. How different was that when now, okay, you're not allowed in studio, everything's resumed. How did the changes happen for writing the program?
Most of it was just ad lib. Like they'd say, okay, Dan, you've got 20 seconds to intro this Toronto Blue Jays thing. So I would just do it on my own with no interaction from Jay. There was no real comedy in those bits unless we pre-taped something that our writing team would put together. Like we did an in-home, like a Masters tournament where I putted a ball around my house. That was about the best thing that we did from those Zoom sessions, because yeah, it was just, and it was only 30-minute shows, and we weren't doing any highlights because the highlights would have been on delay. So it changed everything. And it was something that we did not enjoy and couldn't wait to be over with. And hey, we're still in a pandemic, but they aren't doing the shows from home anymore.
Now, just out of curiosity, because we're talking about how you guys write the show. Just, regardless of what network, for Sportsnet or TSN, when it comes to, say, just a typical episode of SportsCenter, how does one go about writing one of those episodes?
Okay, so the show starts with us being on camera together. That's all ad-libbed. We go to a lead highlight pack every night. Say the Leafs are playing the Flames. Someone behind the scenes, a story editor, is given that game to watch, and they've got a minute 30 to put together a highlight pack. So they put their highlights in. They do a script of here's Austin Matthews, 48. You add your notes to that. And then anytime that we're on camera, if Jay's on camera, he has written what he's saying. And then anything that happens during the highlights that's not on the script, we just ad lib. So a lot of it is the highlight packs are written by other people. Our on cams are written by us. And then the rest is ad lib. So it's a hodgepodge of potpourri that all works out because it's a well-oiled machine. If you gave that to someone off the street, you'd be discombobulated because you're like, I've got this script, but I want to add this. There's these stats over here. This guy's sitting here. I've got this on camera. But like any job, you get so used to it. It's just common practice to do the show. But that's how it works. So large percentage is written, large percentage is ad-libbed, and another percentage is written by Jay and I.
Was that the same way at Fox, or did they have writers for everything?
It was the same. Yeah, exact same. That was the one thing that did translate across the border was it was essentially the show was put together the same. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I do got to bring up something very serious here for a moment here, Dan. And a couple of weeks ago on BOOMSIES, you brought up a story about how you checked into rehab a few days after you were let go by Bell. And I know for the 2020 pandemic, I know a lot of people really struggled with alcoholism. And I know even for myself, like I even got to the point where I don't really even drink too much anymore because it's just like I can't do it anymore. It's too much for yourself. And I know that you've been very, very honest about that. How and when, for the listeners that maybe didn't listen to that episode of BOOMSIES, how and when did you get to a point where you're like, okay, I need to do something about this?
Well, I got laid off on like a Tuesday or Wednesday, and then it was a building problem. And then when I got laid off, it kicked into the high gear. And people were like, well, you must have been drinking a lot to go into rehab like 4 days after you got laid off. I was probably drinking too much, but also I realized come Monday when I didn't have work to go to, I was facing, for the first time in my adult life, being at home at night with no job. So I'm like, holy crap, if I'm already drinking a bottle of wine and smoking a few joints and having a couple of other drinks after work, what am I going to do with no work? So I compare it to standing at the top of a ski jump. I know how to ski, but the chances of me landing that jump are 0.01%. So instead of trying to land that jump, I said, I'm getting the hell off here. I went to a buddy's Super Bowl party on the Sunday. Don't remember anything about it. Woke up on the Monday and I had a cut on my head. And I said to him, I'm not going to drink today. And I went home. First thing I did was crack a White Claw. And then that's where I said, okay, this has to stop because I've had cousins drink themselves to death. I've seen it happen to other family members where it just takes hold of their life. So I'm like, someone get me some help. My friends, family, they all came to my aid. My cousin drove all the way from Ottawa, picked me up. He took me hostage because they knew if they didn't get me into rehab the next day or the day after that I would have found an excuse saying, I don't need help. So asked for help on Monday, rehab Tuesday, and that was February 9th, 2021 that I entered rehab, and that was February 8th was the last day I had a drink. So anyone thinking that you have a problem with weed or drugs or booze, if you think you do, you do. And it's okay to ask for help. And rehab's not the answer. I just needed that to kick myself into high gear because a lot of people, they'll stop drinking for a week and they'll say, hey, look, I can do it. And then go on a 3-day bender. So I had to be shown, no, you can't reward yourself for not drinking for a week or for a month. You need to just do this. And once someone told me on the way into rehab, because I said, I'm never going to have fun again, because drinking and weed, they convince you that, no, you're having fun because of us. Once my friend said, no, you've got it all wrong. You're about to enjoy life for the first time. Once I figured that out myself, then it's never easy, but it just becomes commonplace. Like, I'll go home after this interview, have dinner, and not even think of having a glass of wine, because I do something called play the tape forward. I'm like, what the hell would a glass of wine do? One glass? I would rather wake up with no hangover and enjoy my day and have that mental clarity that is my new drug of choice. Just waking up. I still hate mornings. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a morning person, but waking up with that clarity that I didn't have for the longest time, that is what I love.
I totally agree with you. It's just like, I'm tired of waking up hungover. I'm tired of waking up feeling like shit. But even for yourself, somebody who's in the public eye, and I've mentioned this in the past, is that when people in the public eye, they go through stuff like this, they tend to dehumanize them, because again, they only see what they see in the public eye. They don't think of, say, Dan O'Toole, the person. They only see Dan O'Toole, the TSN sportscaster. So I don't want to end this interview off on a sour note. Now, one of the big things I want to do, and I put it out on Twitter at Gr8Wyte Pod and through my own Twitter account, is I got some listeners and some people to send us some questions. So I got to ask, Dan, are you ready to do a little game that you guys used to do, what I now like to call rapid fire?
I love rapid fire. Perfect. I'm ready.
Yeah. So I do got to let you know now, given that you are on the podcast, is that because you and Jay started rapid fire on your guys' podcast, you guys later came back to TSN, didn't start to do it. I ended up stealing it years ago for my own podcast.
Oh, everyone does rapid fire. You didn't steal anything. You're good.
Anyways. So it's great though. I do love rapid fire, and I always give you guys a shout out whenever I do it. So I actually want to start with my bod Dave. Now, he doesn't really have a question, but he wants to say that he loves BOOMSIES, and he's been using "You're Done" more often in life now. So gotta give
that's great. That's from my daughter Ruby. She gave that to me one day, and now she regrets it every day, because I said something to her and she said, "You're done." So now I'm like, I'm using that forever. So yeah, it's a staple of the podcast. You're done.
Excellent. Okay, so Dan, so let's start off rapid fire by asking, what is your favorite city you got to travel to during your tenure at TSN?
London, England.
What is your favorite event you got to cover either at TSN or for Fox Sports 1?
2010 Vancouver Winter Olympics. Easy. Golden goal.
Now, this comes from my bod Neil. If you had to move to any province than Ontario, which one would you pick and why?
Oh, that's a tough one. See, I love Newfoundland and Labrador. I love Nova Scotia, and I love Saskatchewan. But no offense to my Saskatchewan buddies, but I probably pick Nova Scotia because it's on the ocean. I compare Saskatchewanites to Eastern Canadians, in which they would give you the clothes off their back.
And just a fun fact here, my bod Neil is actually from Newfoundland. So there you go.
Ah, there you go. Perfect.
So this comes from Adam. Is declaring winter over only to have a major snowstorm something both you and Stuntman Stu learned at Algonquin College?
Yes. For some reason, we get into March and I'm like, we made it. Winter's over. And every time a snowstorm hits. So I think it's almost like Groundhog Day now, that it has to happen. And the weather will never agree with what I say or what the groundhog says.
So I just mentioned the gentleman's name. Stuntman Stu wants to know, ask Dan if he recalls his 1996 appearance on the Camilla Scott show. Take care, brush your hair.
I sure do. My roommates and I at Algonquin, we were sitting watching Camilla Scott, which no one knows that show. It's an old talk show that was based in Canada, and they shot it out of Toronto. And after one of the segments, a board came up and it said, "Do you have a roommate you don't get along with?" And I'm like, Well, there's 4 of us living here, so we all concocted a plan. We're like, hey, Scott, let's all pretend we don't get along with you. And so we sent in an email or a letter, or we called in and they interviewed each of us over the phone. And then we got a free trip on the train to Toronto, a free night in a hotel, and we each got like $150 spending money. So we thought we had won the lottery. And we got to appear on the Camilla Scott show where we beat up on our friend Scott. So it was a lot of fun.
Now, I got to ask, does this episode still exist?
Oh, if you can go deep, but back then, no one was recording anything and it'd have to be on YouTube. So you'd have to do a deep dive on YouTube to find it. I do have the VCR tape somewhere, but finding a VCR and finding that tape are 2 different stories.
If that clip still does exist, though, will it be shown on Boomsies?
I don't have the technology. Once we figure out the technology, how to get a VCR tape, yeah, we have to. We've got a lot of things to figure out. Again, we don't even know how to do an interview with someone in the studio. So,
fair enough. If you had to do a 100-meter foot race between producer Tim and Z Money, who would you choose?
Z Money. He's way younger. Easy, hands down. Z Money wins that. I would put 5,000. I would put $50,000 on that.
Well, we're gonna have to see that now on one of the next Boomsies, I'll tell you. So
no, because I already win that bet because Tim will never do that race. Tim,
go.
I've never seen Tim run in my life.
So this question comes in from fan favorite and former Jane Dan podcast guest, Jeremy Taggart. And he wants to ask Dan what his favorite Eddie Money song is.
Take Me Home Tonight.
Oh,
easy.
So good, right? Such a banger.
Just like Ronnie said, be my little baby.
Classic. Ricky wants to know, what advice would you have for men out there who are maybe struggling with their mental health or substance abuse?
Don't be afraid to ask for help. Talk about it. There's so many support groups out there. There's so many therapists. But first have the conversation with friends or family, and they will be so supportive. That's all I can say is don't keep it to yourself. And the more you voice it and the more you don't keep it a secret, it's almost like, well, I was born Catholic. It's almost like going to confession. You're like, I'm not keeping that bottled in anymore. It's like shaking a bottle over and over and never taking the cap off. And that's just building up. So when you eventually take the cap off, you're like, wow, that relieves a lot of pressure. So, with regards to substance abuse, just again, if you question it, if you think you do, yeah, you do. And the support system for that as well is phenomenal. I've played on sports teams for my entire life. I've been part of huge broadcast networks, but the support system and the recovery community is something I've never experienced because everyone's rooting for you to win. You might be on a team, and you might have a great game deep down. We weren't being interviewed at the time. Someone's on that team's like, I didn't want him to score 3 goals. I didn't want him to play good. Someone at your work, they aren't rooting for you to become a better broadcaster because then you're moving ahead of them on the totem pole. In the recovery community, people want nothing in return and they only root for you. So that's what I've found has been amazing is the support system that is available out there.
If somebody put a gun to your head and you were forced to choose between Ben Teller's Would You Rather or Mike Botticello reading a book, which one would you choose?
Oh, Mike Botticello reading a book would be amazing. I would watch that. I would pay money to see that because he does not know how to read.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jane Dan podcast fans know that very well. Wes wants to know, and this is a reference to the episode of Boomsies regarding your car that has no engine. Are we going to poop in your car?
So far I got 5 requests. So unless those tickets are like $5,000 each, then I don't see it happening. Still at a garage. I need a real master mechanic to finagle that engine. But it's still part of the mix. It's not completely shot down, but we still might sell the poop tickets.
Now, to close off rapid fire, and this is a question that the late James Lipton always asked on Inside the Actor Studio. Dan, what is your favorite curse word?
Fuck.
I would also accept motherfucker. It's good.
Yeah, and I also add a lot of things to like you fuck dick. I just add a lot of things with it before it, but usually after it, and it usually works.
Who was the guy at Fox that he walked up to you and he's like, "Hey, slap dick"?
I don't know, because I say that I call people slap nuts. I'm like, hey, slap nuts, and that always makes them laugh and think about what it means. But slap nuts is always a good greeting.
Well, I know when
slap dick. Who the hell would that have been? I forget.
I can't remember off the top of my head either, to be honest with you. But I remember when I met Jonathan Torrens, he walked up to me and goes, "Hey, what's going on there, big nuts?"
What a classic human he is.
He really is. Dan, I cannot express how excited I was to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for doing this. Now, before we close off this interview, where can my listeners find you on social media, and where can they find the podcast? Boomsies.
Boomsies. Just put it in Google, but make sure you don't do it with voice command because boobies comes up. But if you put Boomsies in Google, you'll find the podcast in audio and video form. It's wherever you find podcasts. And on social media, Dan G. O'Toole. It looks like Dang, but my middle name is Gerard. So it's Dan Gerard O'Toole, Dan G. O'Toole on Instagram and Twitter.
Well, that wraps up this episode of the Gr8Wyte Experience. Just a reminder, you can find the show on Twitter at Gr8WytePod, as well as on YouTube and Spotify. For this episode, I am your host, Taylor Gibson, and I'll see you next time.